A deaf man pressed his hand against a window pane. On the other side of the glass, something pressed back. Something with claws 4 inches long, something with amber eyes that had been watching him every single night for 3 years. And he never heard it, not once, not a single footstep, not a single breath, not the snap of a branch, not the creak of the porch steps under 400 pounds. Because Harold Peska was born deaf. His wife, Ruth, was born deaf. And the thing that watched them from the trees had figured that out a long time ago. My name is Harold Peska. I'm 78 years old. I've never heard a sound in my life. Not a bird, not thunder, not my own daughter's first cry, not my wife's name spoken aloud, and not the creature that stood outside our cabin window night after night, year after year, for 6 years straight. Ruth is gone now. She passed last March at the age of 76, and I made her a promise before she died. The kind of promise you don't break, not in this life, not in any other. I told her I would tell our story, every detail, every impossible night, every moment of terror and wonder that we kept secret for more than 2 decades. So here I am, an old deaf man, breaking a silence that has nothing to do with sound. But before I tell you what watched us, I need to tell you why we were there. Why 2 deaf people would choose to move to 47 acres of wilderness in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, 22 miles southeast of a town called Wakefield, 6 miles from the nearest neighbor, with no phone, no television, no way to call for help, and no way to hear danger coming. Because that's the part that changes everything. That's the part that made us different from every other person who's ever seen one of these things. We couldn't hear it coming. We couldn't hear it breathing. We couldn't hear it circling our cabin in the dead of night. And it knew that. From the very beginning, it knew. Ruth and I met in 1969 at the Illinois School for the Deaf in Jacksonville. She was signing across the cafeteria, and her hands moved like birds in flight, fast and graceful, and full of life. I was 22 years old. She was 22. I watched her hands from across that room, and I knew. By 1971, we were married. We spent the next 2 decades bouncing between small towns across the Midwest. Jacksonville, Springfield, Decatur. I worked as a carpenter. Ruth did bookkeeping for local businesses. We raised a daughter named Claire who could hear just fine and who grew up translating the world for parents who lived on the other side of sound. We were happy enough. But the hearing world never quite fit us. It wasn't cruelty. It was something quieter than cruelty. We were always standing on the other side of a window, watching life happen with the sound turned off. People talked around us, made decisions for us, smiled too wide, spoke too slow, treated us like children who had somehow gotten old. After 25 years of that, something inside both of us was worn down to the bone. By 1994, Claire had grown and moved to Chicago. Ruth looked at me across our kitchen table in Decatur and signed 3 words that changed everything. Let's go quiet. I knew exactly what she meant. We'd been dreaming about it for years. Not dreaming in sound the way hearing people dream, dreaming in movement and space and the ache for somewhere, that our silence wasn't a condition. It was the whole point. In the spring of 1995, we found it. 47 acres of unimproved land in Gogebic County. End of a dirt logging road that hadn't been maintained since the 70s. Dense mixed forest, sugar maple, yellow birch, eastern hemlock, white pine, a spring-fed creek cutting through the southern third, and a 2-acre natural clearing on a gentle rise near the center. That clearing is where we built our home. I built it with my own hands over 7 months, June through December of 1995. Ruth beside me every single day. We felled our own timber, milled it with a portable sawmill I'd bought secondhand from a retired logger in Ironwood for $800. The cabin was 24 by 32 feet, single story with a sleeping loft, wood stove for heat, hand pump connected to a shallow well, and windows on all 4 sides because Ruth insisted. She said a deaf woman needs to see everything. She needed light, the way hearing people need sound. She needed sight lines. She needed to see what was coming. She had no idea how right she was. We moved in on January 3rd, 1996. The temperature that night was 14 below zero. The wood stove was cranking. The cabin smelled like fresh-cut pine and wood smoke. We sat on the floor eating canned soup because we didn't have chairs yet. And Ruth looked at me and signed, "We did it. We're free." And we were. For the first time in 47 years of life. The forest didn't care that we were deaf. The trees didn't talk. The creek didn't need an audience. The snow fell in silence for everyone, not just for us. We had found the one place on earth where everyone was as deaf as we were. Now here's what I need you to understand before this story goes where it's going. When you're deaf in the wilderness, you lose something that hearing people take for granted. You lose the alarm system, every snapped twig, every rustling leaf, every footstep crunching through frozen snow, every growl in the underbrush, every breath fogging outside your window at 2 o'clock in the morning. Hearing people get all of that for free. It's built into the body. Ruth and I got none of it. Zero. Our entire defensive capability was visual. If we couldn't see it, it didn't exist. If it happened behind us, it never happened. If it came in the dark, when seeing was at its weakest, we were as exposed as 2 people could be. Remember that. Hold on to it, because something was about to exploit that weakness in a way we never could have imagined. The first 3 years were hard, and then they were good, and then they were something else entirely. But I didn't know that last part yet. We learned the land the only way you can learn land that wants to kill you, through trial and error and frozen pipes and mistakes that the Upper Peninsula punished without mercy or hesitation. I underestimated firewood by 2 cords that first winter and spent February splitting wood in blizzards, which is about as miserable as a person can get without dying. Ruth's well pump froze twice. The second time, I had to dig 3 feet through frozen ground to replace a section of pipe with hands so cold I couldn't feel the wrench. We lost a month's worth of dried food to mice, but we adapted. That's what we'd been doing our whole lives. Adapting. By the 3rd winter, we were thriving. Garden producing vegetables for 7 months. Root cellar staying cool in summer and above freezing in winter. Smokehouse, chicken coop, workshop, where I did finish carpentry when the weather was too rough for outside work. Ruth kept bees and made candles, and maintained a journal she wrote in every night by kerosene lamp, filling page after page with her small, precise handwriting. We drove to Wakefield once a month for supplies, flour, sugar, salt, ammunition, kerosene, batteries, and a bag of candy. Ruth pretended was for emergencies, but that I'd catch her eating on the porch every Sunday afternoon with a guilty look that fooled nobody. We were self-sufficient. We were happy. We were completely, profoundly alone. At least that's what we believed, because something had been watching us the entire time, every night, from the tree line, and we never knew. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the way we discovered it matters. It didn't come through sound. It couldn't. Sound didn't exist in our world. It came through the chickens. October 1998, almost 3 years after we'd moved in. I walked to the coop one morning to collect eggs and found all 8 hens pressed into the far corner, like they were trying to push through the wall. Packed so tight, they looked like one organism with 16 terrified eyes. Frozen, not moving, not clucking as far as I could tell, just staring at the door I'd walked through. They weren't afraid of me. I'd fed them every morning for 2 years. They were afraid of what had been there before me. Then I noticed the smell. I need to explain something about being deaf. When one sense is absent, others compensate. My sense of smell is something most hearing people can't relate to. I can smell a storm coming 30 miles out. I can tell white pine from red pine across a room. What I smelled in that chicken coop was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Thick, musky, undeniably animal, but with something sharp underneath, almost chemical. Like a wet dog, magnified tenfold and mixed with something dead. My eyes watered. The smell was coming from outside. I walked the perimeter. Found it on the north wall. Something had rubbed against the rough sawn pine boards. Dark, oily residue smeared at a height of 5.5 feet off the ground. Tacky. Not yet dry. Whatever left it had been there hours ago, not days. I scraped some into a jar and brought it inside. Ruth smelled it and her face changed. She signed, "Animal." I signed, "What kind?" She shook her head. She didn't know. Neither did I. But here's the question that kept me awake that night. What kind of animal rubs against a wall at 5.5 feet? I checked the ground that afternoon. What I found shifted something inside me that has never shifted back. The prints were canine in basic structure. Elongated pad, 4 toes, claw marks ahead of each. But they were enormous. The longest print measured just over 7 inches from back of the pad to tip of longest claw impression. For reference, the biggest wolf track I'd ever found on our property was 4.75 inches. These were nearly double. The impression depth suggested something well over 300 pounds, and the stride pattern was wrong for any 4-legged animal. The prints were spaced as if whatever made them was walking on 2 legs, 44 inches between steps. I measured 3 times. I didn't believe my own tape measure. I told Ruth it was a bear. She looked at me with those sharp brown eyes and signed, "Bears don't stand that tall." The residue was at 5.5 feet. A black bear rubbing a wall stands about 4 feet at the shoulder. She was right. I had no answer. So I did what frightened men have done since the beginning of time. I changed the subject. Ruth never let anything go. Not in 27 years of marriage. Not once. The next morning, she was up before me, sitting at the kitchen table with her journal, wearing the face that meant she'd been thinking all night and had arrived at a conclusion I wasn't going to enjoy. She signed slowly, deliberately. "Harold, the garden." She led me outside into a grey, heavy October morning, took me to the garden on the east side of the clearing, 40 feet from the cabin, fenced with 4-foot chicken wire on cedar posts. She pointed at the ground outside the fence on the north side. More tracks, the same enormous canine prints, the same bipedal spacing. But these weren't fresh. Some were faded, partially filled with debris and dead leaves. Some were sharper, more recent. They overlapped each other in layers like geological strata. dozens of them, spanning weeks at minimum, maybe months. Something had been coming to the outside of our garden fence over and over again, standing there. And we'd had no idea. Ruth pointed at the cabin, then at the tracks, then at the cabin again. She was tracing the sight line. From where those tracks were clustered, whatever stood there had a direct, unobstructed view through our east-facing kitchen window. It could see our table, our stove, us, signing to each other by lamplight, every evening, for months. That's when the first real fear hit. Not fear of a predator, fear of being watched, fear that our silence, the very thing we'd moved 500 miles to celebrate, had made us the most vulnerable people in these woods. My mind started replaying memories and inserting the creature into them. Had it been there in July, when I spent an entire afternoon splitting wood shirtless in the heat? Had it been standing there in August, when Ruth sat on the porch reading until after dark? Had it been watching on our anniversary, when we ate dinner outside by candlelight, two deaf people surrounded by darkness they couldn't hear into? Every memory from the last 3 years was now contaminated. Every quiet evening, every midnight trip to the outhouse, every early morning walk to the chicken coop in pre-dawn blackness. It had been there for all of it, or could have been. The not knowing was worse than any definite answer. Every snapped twig that a hearing person would have flinched at, we'd missed. Every midnight footfall, slept through. We were living in a world of perfect silence, and something had been exploiting that silence to study us like specimens in a jar. But here's the part that changes everything. What Ruth found next made it so much worse, and so much stranger. She spent 3 days walking every accessible inch of our 47 acres. Methodical, thorough, the same bookkeeper's mind that balanced ledgers down to the penny, now cataloging evidence of something impossible. Along the north tree line, she found a path. Not a deer path. Those are narrow and meandering. This was wider, about 2 feet across, running parallel to our clearing at a consistent distance of 30 feet inside the trees. Ground beaten, flat by repeated heavy passage. Along this path, at irregular intervals, she found bedding spots, flattened circles about 3 feet across, where something massive had settled in, sat or lain down, stayed a while. From every single one of those spots, there was a clear sight line to our cabin. She mapped 9 along the north tree line alone. 9 observation points, some fresh, some old with new growth fighting to reclaim the compressed earth. This thing had established a patrol route, multiple viewing angles, a schedule as deliberate and disciplined as a surveillance operation. This wasn't a passing animal. This was a resident, something that had moved in alongside us and set up its own routine around ours. I drove to Wakefield, not for supplies, for answers. The public library was a single room in the basement of the town hall. The librarian was Donna Koskinen, there since 1974. I wrote my questions on a notepad. Large predators in Gogebic County, wolf-like but larger, possibly bipedal. She read the note, looked at me over her glasses for a long moment, wrote back, "How far are you from the Presque River?" I wrote, "About 4 miles southeast." She nodded, disappeared into a back room, came back with a manila folder, soft at the edges from handling, no label. "This stays here," she wrote. "You can read it. It doesn't leave the building." Inside, photocopies, newspaper clippings from the Ironwood Daily Globe and the Wakefield News, 1971 to 1993. Letters, A handwritten DNR report on official letterhead, photocopied so many times the edges were ghosting. A hand-drawn map of Gogebic County with red circles marked at various locations. 7 of those circles were within 10 miles of our property. The clippings told the same story in different voices across 3 decades. Livestock found dead in ways that didn't match any known predator. Large animals dragged impossible distances, kills that showed both brute force and strange precision. Dogs vanishing from properties near the national forest, some found days later in places they couldn't have reached on their own. A hunter in 1978 who swore he was trailed for 2 miles by something walking on 2 legs that he could hear pacing him through the brush, but could never see, no matter how fast he spun around. 2 hikers in 1982 who reported a massive dark shape crossing a logging road 200 yards ahead of them, upright, moving with a speed and fluidity that no bear could match. And a family near Marinisco, 1985. They'd lived in their cabin for 7 years. Good people, tough people, the kind who don't scare easy. They abandoned everything they owned after a large dog-like animal stood upright on their porch at 3 in the morning. Looking through their window, the wife told the reporter she could see its breath on the glass. She said its eyes reflected the kitchen light. She said it looked at her the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. Looking through their window, breath on the glass, eyes reflecting light. I read that 3 times. My hands were shaking because she could have been describing our cabin, our window, our lives. The DNR report from 1983 described animal mutilations consistent with a large predator but noted track evidence suggesting an animal of unusual size and locomotion not consistent with any known species in the Upper Peninsula. It recommended further investigation. There was no evidence further investigation ever happened. Before I left, Donna wrote one more note. The Ojibwe have stories, hundreds of years old. They call it Wendigo Animosh. I asked what it meant. Roughly Wendigo dog, something in between, something that shouldn't exist. I drove home in the dark. The headlights cut tunnels through the forest on both sides of the logging road. Every shadow between the trunks could have held something upright and watching. Every gap in the canopy was a space where something 7 feet tall could stand. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles went white. When I pulled into the clearing and saw the warm glow of Ruth's kerosene lamp in the kitchen window, I understood something new. That light wasn't just our home. It was a beacon. Every night for 3 years, we'd been broadcasting our location, our routine, our helplessness into 47 acres of dark forest. And something had been tuned in. I fortified. Motion sensor lights on all 4 sides, car battery charged by solar panel, fishing line strung between trees at the clearing's edge with white cloth strips as visual trip alarms, brush cut back to extend sightlines, Winchester 30-30 by the front door, 12 gauge by the back. Ruth watched this for 3 silent days. On the 4th, she grabbed my arm and turned me to face her. Tell me everything. So I told her, all of it, the folder, the clippings, the DNR report, the Ojibwe name, everything. I watched her face for the moment she'd say we needed to leave. It never came. Her face went through fear and passed it into something harder, something I knew from 27 years of marriage. She was adapting, the way she'd adapted to deafness, to the hearing world, to motherhood, to 3 winters in the Michigan wilderness. Then she signed something that made my blood run cold. It hasn't hurt us. I stared at her. It hasn't hurt the chickens, hasn't damaged the garden, hasn't tried to get inside. 3 years, Harold. She was right. All that evidence, tracks, bedding spots, the patrol, the oily residue. And not one mark of aggression, not one scratch on the cabin, not one dead chicken. Whatever this thing was, it had been watching with a discipline that went far beyond animal curiosity. Then she signed the thing that tilted the ground under my feet. Maybe it's not watching us because we're prey. Maybe it's watching us because it's never seen anything like us before. 2 humans who don't make sound. We must be the strangest thing it's ever encountered. Think about that for a second. To a creature that perceived the world through hearing. Heartbeats, footfalls, breathing, the constant chatter and clamor of human life. Ruth and I were impossible. We moved without the audio track. We communicated in silence. Our language was movement, not sound. We were ghosts in our own home. And for something built around sound, we were the most fascinating thing in that forest. It wasn't hunting us. It was studying us. We didn't leave. I know how that sounds. You saw a monster and you stayed. But Ruth and I had spent our entire lives being told what we couldn't handle, what we couldn't do, where we couldn't go. This cabin was the first thing that was truly ours, the first place where our silence was a feature, not a flaw, and we were not going to let fear take it from us. So we stayed, and we watched back. Ruth built a tracking system. Every morning, perimeter walk, track locations and freshness, bedding spot usage, weather conditions, moon phases. 2 weeks of data and the patterns appeared. The creature came almost every night, skipped the worst storms, arrived after full dark, left before dawn, favored the north tree line, circled the clearing at least once per visit, and its preferred resting spot was a depression behind a cluster of hemlocks. 35 feet from our loft window, our bedroom, it could see directly in, where we slept every night, separated by 35 feet of open air and 1 pane of glass. When that sank in, I didn't sleep for 4 nights, just lay there, staring north through the window, watching for movement, watching for the amber reflection of eyes. On the 5th night, Ruth reached over in the dark and took my hand, signed 1 letter, R. Our private shorthand for rest. I closed my eyes, slept. Morning came. The tracks were there. It had come. It had sat 35 feet away. It had done nothing. December brought deep snow, and the snow revealed what bare ground had hidden. Full body impressions at the bedding spots. 7 feet long, nearly 3 feet wide at the shoulders. When it stood, bipedal stride close to 4 feet. When it dropped to all fours to move through dense brush, the pattern shifted to a loping gait with a stride of nearly 6 feet. Weight between 350 and 450 pounds by my best calculation, based on impression depth and soil density. This was not a wolf. This was not a bear. This was something else entirely. And on December 14th, 1998, the night of the Geminide meteor shower, I stopped calculating and started believing, because I saw it. Ruth and I bundled up and lay on the porch to watch the sky. The night was clear and moonless, perfect for meteors. The cold was brutal, but we didn't care. We lay on a blanket with our breath rising in clouds and watched streaks of light tear across the frozen sky. It was one of those rare moments of perfect peace, the kind you only get when you're 100 miles from city lights, and the universe feels close enough to touch. Ruth fell asleep on the blanket, the way she did when she was truly at peace. Her face relaxed, her hands still, which was rare for Ruth even in sleep. She usually signed in her dreams, her fingers having conversations with people who existed only in the silent country, behind her closed eyes. I stayed awake, watching the sky, feeling the cold soak up through the blanket into my bones. Then one meteor flared brighter than all the rest, bright enough to throw shadows across the clearing. And in that half-second of blue-white light, there it was, standing at the north tree line, upright, 2 legs, head above the lowest hemlock branches, which meant 7.5 feet at minimum, shoulders impossibly broad, dark fur that could have been black or deep charcoal, arms hanging past its hips, too long for any human proportion, and the hands, not paws, hands, long articulated fingers with something at the tips that caught the meteor light, claws, curved, thick, on fingers that could grip and manipulate. But the head is what stopped my heart, canine, long muzzle, erect pointed ears, wolf-like cranial structure, mounted on a body that stood upright, like a man. The proportions were wrong for both species, something between, something that shouldn't exist. And it was looking directly at me, amber gold eyes, bright and intelligent, and absolutely fixed on mine, not on sleeping Ruth, on me, the one who was awake, the one who was looking back. In that frozen moment, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood, what it means to be prey, to be seen by something above you in every measurable way, bigger, faster, stronger, better equipped for the darkness you're both standing in. And to know in the oldest part of your brain, the part that remembers when humans were not in charge, that you are alive only because this thing has chosen to let you be alive. The meteor faded. Darkness returned. I lay paralyzed. Eventually I woke Ruth. She read my face in an instant. You saw it. Yes. Is it still there? I don't know. We went inside. I sat in the kitchen with the shotgun across my lap. Neither of us signed for a long time. When I finally described everything, the height, the fur, the hands, the canine head on the upright body, the eyes, Ruth was quiet. Then she signed words I've carried every day since. It's been watching us for 3 years, and we're still here. It could have killed us 1,000 times. It chose not to. That's not an animal, Harold. Animals don't choose. And that's when the story goes somewhere nobody expects. After I saw it, the creature stopped hiding. The tracks crept closer, not suddenly, not in any way that felt threatening. Gradually, inch by inch, night by night, like a person edging forward in a waiting room when they think nobody's watching. The bedding impressions deepened from longer stays. The observation points on the east and west sides showed more frequent use, as if it was varying its angle, trying to see us from different perspectives. And January 1999, tracks on the porch, not near the porch, not at the edge of the clearing, on the porch, up the 3 wooden steps I'd built with my own hands, across the deck where Ruth and I had watched meteors, to the front window, and back. 2 sets of prints sunk deep in overnight snow, a round trip. It had walked to our window the way a person walks to a neighbor's house to check if the lights are on. I placed my hand over one print. My carpenter's hand, weathered and calloused from 30 years of hammers and timber and cold mornings, looked like a child's hand next to that track. The pad covered my entire palm and most of my fingers. The claw marks extended 2 inches past the toe pads, and between the pads and the claws, the impressions of those long, articulated fingers. Fingers that could have turned my doorknob. fingers that could have punched through the glass, fingers that had chosen instead to simply stand and look. I stopped being afraid that morning. Really stopped. Not the kind of not afraid where you're still afraid underneath, but pretending. The real thing. Because Ruth was right. 3 years, 1,000 nights, 1,000 chances to break the glass, push through the door, take what it wanted, and it had chosen every single time to just watch, to just be near. Something shifted in me that January morning, standing in the cold with my hand inside a monster's footprint. Fear gave way to curiosity, and curiosity, in a deaf man who'd spent his whole life being underestimated, is a powerful and dangerous thing. Over the next 2 years, the creature became part of our lives the way the creek and the hemlocks were part of our lives. A constant, a presence you stopped questioning and simply lived with. It came to the windows while we were awake now. The pretense of secrecy was over. First time. I was doing joinery at the kitchen table, a cabinet with dovetail corners, precise work, my hands steady and focused. The east motion light kicked on, and I looked up, and my hands were no longer steady. There it was, head level with the top of the window frame, 6 feet 8 inches off the ground, muzzle inches from the glass. Breath fogging the pane in steady rhythmic plumes that appeared and faded, like a slow heartbeat made visible. And its eyes were locked on my hands, not my face, my hands, watching me work the way I might watch a bird build a nest, with total absorbed fascination. I froze, its gaze tracked from my hands to my face. Eye contact, the second time. This close, I could see the amber color had flecks of darker gold in it, like sunlight through resin. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable and unsettling. Not human intelligence. Something parallel. Something that had arrived at awareness by a completely different road. But this time, I was ready. Instinct overrode fear. I picked up the chisel, went back to the dovetail joint, and watched from the corner of my eye as it watched me work for 15 minutes. Its head tilted slightly when I changed tools. Its eyes tracked each cut, each tap of the mallet. 15 minutes. Then it stepped back and vanished into the dark, without a sound. Not that I would have heard one. The window visits became routine. 2, 3 times a week, always at night, always at the east or north windows, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for half an hour, and it was drawn to our hands, to our signing. Ruth noticed it first. It watches our conversations. She signed one evening after it had been at the window for 20 minutes while we discussed what to plant in the spring garden. Its eyes move back and forth between us, like it's following what we're saying. I believe now that our sign language captivated it the way its existence captivated us. A creature that perceived the world through sound, watching 2 beings communicate in perfect visible silence. We were its puzzle. It was ours. But what happened next is the part that still makes me shake. Ruth started leaving food on the porch railing. I protested. Wildlife Management 101 says you don't habituate wild animals. Ruth pointed out that this wasn't wildlife in any conventional sense. It was already habituated. And since we couldn't speak to it, couldn't even speak to each other in a way it could hear, our only shared language was action, behavior. What we did, not what we said. Smoked venison on the railing, always taken. Apples, always taken. Raw eggs, taken, and the shells left behind. Not smashed and scattered the way a raccoon would, but crushed into fine, even fragments. Deliberate, almost dainty. Cooked food always accepted. Raw vegetables sometimes left. Fruit always taken. And Ruth's honey from her own bees, licked from the jar so thoroughly it looked washed. These were preferences, choices, a palate. Then the Dogman started giving back. A brook trout, 14 inches, freshly caught, still wet, still limp, placed on the porch railing exactly where Ruth left the food. She cried when she found it, stood on the porch in the morning light with tears running down her face, and signed with trembling hands, "It's giving back." After that, the gifts came regularly. Fish, always fresh, always placed with care. A rabbit, killed cleanly with a single blow, undamaged. Wild blackberries, so ripe and perfect, they looked individually selected, which they were by those long-clawed fingers, hands built for violence, picking berries in the dark with a gentleness they were never designed for. That image has lived inside me for 27 years, a creature that could tear a tree apart, picking blackberries for a deaf woman. September 22nd, 2000. Ruth's birthday, 53 years old. I made her mother's yellow cake with brown sugar frosting. We ate it on the porch, signing about nothing important, the way married people do when the conversation matters more than its content. As the sun set, Ruth placed the leftover quarter cake on the railing. I said nothing, because that was our life. We were people who left birthday cake for a Dogman. Morning, cake gone, plate clean, and beside the plate, arranged in a careful row, 7 polished creek stones, smooth, round, each a different color: gray, white, reddish-brown, dark green, pale green, amber, black, arranged with deliberate precision by something that understood the concept of a gift. Ruth picked them up one by one, held them in her palm, looked at me. It's not just watching anymore. It's thinking. She put those stones in a leather pouch on a cord around her neck. She wore them every day for the rest of her life. When she was buried last March, they went with her. The only thing she asked for. But the moment that broke me open, the one I've never told anyone, happened in the fall of 2008. Ruth was diagnosed with breast cancer. Treatment in Marquette. Gone for weeks. I stayed behind. Chickens, garden, wood stove. For the first time in 13 years, I was alone on that property. First night without her, I sat at the kitchen table and cried. I'm not ashamed. I was a 61-year-old deaf man in the Michigan wilderness, and my wife had cancer, and I was scared in a way that had nothing to do with creatures in the forest. I cried until there was nothing left. Then I sat in the lamplight, hollow, staring. The east motion light kicked on. It was there, at the window, but not at its usual distance, pressed against the glass, close enough that I could see details I'd never seen before. The texture of fur around its eyes, the way the amber irises held the lamplight, the slow flare of its nostrils, and its expression. I know how this sounds. I know people will say I was projecting, grieving, alone, seeing what I needed to see, but I'm telling you what I saw. Its brow was furrowed, the corners of its mouth drawn down, ears back into the sides instead of erect. And it was looking at my face, at my tears, at my reddened eyes, at the slump of my shoulders, with something I can only call concern. It knew something was wrong. It hadn't come to study me. It had come to check on me. We looked at each other for a long time. Then I lifted my hand, pressed my palm flat against the glass. 5 fingers spread. The creature shifted, raised one massive hand, those long fingers, those claws that could have shattered the glass and everything behind it, and pressed its palm against the pane opposite mine. Its hand dwarfed mine completely. Fingers extended 3 inches past mine, and through that quarter-inch of old glass, I felt its warmth, the heat of something impossibly alive, something that shouldn't exist, pressing its hand against mine while my wife fought cancer 200 miles away, and I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. 5 minutes, 10, an age. Then it pulled back, stepped into the dark, disappeared. I kept my palm against the glass where its warmth was already fading, and finally understood what Ruth had been saying since 1998. It wasn't watching us. It was with us. It had chosen us the way we chose this land, and in whatever framework of thought and feeling operated behind those amber eyes, it cared about what happened to us. Ruth came home in November, cancer in remission. First thing she did was go to the porch and leave a piece of hospital jello, the only thing she'd been able to keep down during chemo. Laughed her silent laugh, shoulders shaking, eyes squeezed shut, and signed, "I bet it's never had jello before." Morning, jello gone. 3 perfect eagle feathers laid side by side on the railing. Into the pouch with the stones. We named it. Ruth named it. She called it Hush. Because that's what it was. The hush in the forest. The silence between sounds that hearing people never notice, but that deaf people live inside every moment of their lives. Hush was the quiet that surrounded us, the guardian of our silence. The name fit like nothing else could. After she named it, Ruth talked about Hush, the way you talk about a difficult neighbor who has slowly become a friend, with a mix of exasperation and genuine affection. The years after Ruth's recovery were the best of my life. I need you to understand how strange that sentence is. The best years of my life were the ones I spent in my 60s, living off the grid in the Michigan wilderness, watched every night through my own windows by something 7 feet tall with claws and a wolf's head. And yet, those years had a completeness to them, a wholeness. Ruth was healthy, the land was good to us, and every night, a creature the size of a grizzly bear came to our window, like a neighbor checking in, and we left each other gifts across the border of lamplight and darkness, and somehow that was normal. Somehow that was home. Ruth's journal documented 11 years of nightly visits. 11 years. That's 4,000 nights. Give or take storms, food left and taken, gifts exchanged, and those long quiet moments at the window where 2 species that should have been terrified of each other simply existed in each other's presence. The gifts became more complex over the years, arranged objects, patterns of stones and sticks that Ruth was convinced were attempts at communication. She spent hours studying them, sketching them, cross-referencing patterns, looking for meaning the way a cryptographer looks for a key. I don't know if she cracked the code. She never told me she had, but she never stopped trying, not even when her hands could barely hold the pencil. We grew old together, all 3 of us. I turned 55, then 60, then 65. Ruth's hair went silver, and the lines around her eyes deepened into maps of every laugh and worry and silent conversation of our marriage. Her beautiful hands, her voice, her lifeline, the first thing I fell in love with, developed arthritis that slowed her signing, made her careful where she'd once been fluid. Watching her sign became like watching someone speak through pain. Every word cost more. Every word mattered more. Hush aged too, though on a different timeline. Gray spreading from muzzle to chest and the tips of its pointed ears. Movements stiffer, more deliberate, favoring its right side when it settled in, as if the left hip ached in cold weather. Some nights it didn't stand at the window anymore. just sat beneath it, back against the exterior wall, head tilted so we could see the top of its graying skull through the glass, not watching, resting, being near. Ruth and I would sit on the floor on our side, backs against the same wall, three aging creatures separated by 6 inches of pine and plaster, growing old in the silence that brought us all together. I've never been closer to anything than I was to those two. The deaf woman on one side of me, the impossible thing on the other. I'm going to tell you how it ends, because Ruth would want the truth. And the truth is that nothing lasts. Spring of 2001, the track stopped. Not gradually, not a slow fade. Overnight, one day there. Next morning gone, bedding spots unused, porch food untouched. The fish Ruth had left sat there until it attracted flies, and she had to throw it away. We searched every day for 2 weeks, expanding circles through forest that was just beginning to thaw, snow retreating to reveal the muddy evidence of a long winter. We looked for tracks, for scat, for hair caught on bark, for that oily residue on tree trunks. Nothing. The patrol path was there, beaten into the earth by years of heavy passage, but nothing fresh moved along it. The bedding spots were indentations in the ground, with new shoots already pushing up through the compressed soil. The forest was reclaiming what Hush had claimed. On the 15th day, Ruth found it. 1/4 mile north of the clearing, just off the patrol path. A depression at the base of a hemlock tree. Large enough for something 7 feet long. Dark fur caught in bark, streaked heavily with gray. That smell, musky, sharp, but fainter than we'd ever encountered it. Fading the way a memory fades, Ruth knelt beside that depression, pressed her hand into the impression the way I'd pressed mine against the glass that night in 2008. Closed her eyes. Her lips moved, not signing, not speaking, because Ruth had never spoken. Something else, something private, something between her and whatever remained in that hollow in the earth. I watched the woman I'd loved for 30 years say goodbye to something neither of us had ever expected to love. Neither of us had ever expected to grieve. We never saw Hush again. No body, no violence, no struggle, no final visit to the window. It simply stopped. Ruth believed it went somewhere deep in the forest to do what old wild things do when their time comes. Find a quiet place away from the eyes that knew them. Let the earth take them back. I hope she was right. I hope wherever it went, the silence was gentle. We stayed until 2019. Ruth's cancer returned. Different, aggressive. She needed to be near a hospital. Marquette, an apartment that felt like a coffin after 24 years of forest and sky. Ruth died on March 7th, 2024, at 76, holding the leather pouch, 7 stones, 3 eagle feathers. Her last sign, the last thing her arthritic hands ever shaped, was Hush. I don't know what she meant. His name, permission to be quiet, a description of where she was going, into the hush, into the silence, into whatever waits on the other side of sound. I don't know what that creature was. I've read the theories, seen the blurry photos and shaky footage. People who saw something for 3 seconds and called it a dogman. Ruth and I lived with one for 6 years, arm's reach. Nothing between us but glass and the mutual agreement not to break it. I know it was intelligent. I know it was capable of kindness. I know it watched 2 deaf people with the same patience we watched it. And in the silence, that was the only world Ruth and I ever knew. It found something worth coming back to, night after night, year after year. Some people will hear this and call me a liar, a fool, a lonely old man who invented a friend to fill the quiet. That's fine. I've been underestimated my whole life. But I'm 78, deaf since birth. I built a cabin with my own hands and lived in the wilderness for 24 years with the only woman I ever loved. And every night, something impossible pressed its hand against our window. If that makes me crazy, I've been crazy for the best part of my life. I wouldn't trade a single night. Be safe out there. Respect the silence. And if you ever find yourself in the deep woods and the hair on your neck stands up and you feel something watching from the tree line, maybe don't run. Maybe just be still. Let it watch. You might be the most interesting thing it's ever seen. And if you're very lucky, it might leave you blackberries in the morning. If this story moved you, if Ruth's story matters to you the way it matters to me, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel. We share stories from people who've seen things they can't explain and carried the weight for decades. Leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done. Would you have stayed? Ruth always said the bravest thing a person can do is stay. Stay quiet. Stay curious. Stay open to what the darkness might be offering. Good night. Listen to the silence. There might be something in it.